This free kick has to be good. It is good. Oh, it's incredible! Absolutely remarkable! The goalkeeper has scored!
What you just saw was Italian goalkeeper Alberto Brignoli score the game-tying goal that saved his team Benevento from losing. Not only that, it happened in the last minute of the game, and not only that, it broke a record-breaking 14-game losing streak for Benevento. I mean, they didn't win, but they didn't lose. And while most people saw that event for the first time on a screen or maybe even in a crowd, the first time I ever saw that goal was like this. An entry in a data table. Specifically one featured in this paper titled, this, which tracks millions of ball kicks, who kicked it, where they kicked it, when they kicked it, and even what temperature was that day, all of which can be used to do some really cool stuff that I think is interesting even if you don't follow soccer. Like this, a network made from passes, each node representing a player and each line representing, passes between them, and we can use that to find which networks make better teams. Benevento was objectively a bad team, as we'll see. So how does its passing network compare with higher performing teams like, say, FC Bayern Munich? And that's more or less what today's video is about, because soccer aside, this is actually what I do for a living. Just instead of comparing soccer team networks, I'm comparing brain networks. So even if you don't care about soccer, I think there's some fun to be had here. I mean, for a very particular definition of the word fun. How did I make this network? Well, conceptually, it's pretty simple. If player A passes the ball to player B, then we'll draw a directed link from A to B. And the more that A passes to B per game, the thicker we can draw that link. So here's the Croatian and French team passes for the final match of the 2018 World Cup. Because we know that France won, sadly, we can collect all the losing networks and all the winning networks to see what differentiates a losing and winning team. And that's essentially what we're going to be doing. And like I said, all of this data comes from a research project titled A Public Dataset of Spatiotemporal Match Events in Soccer Competitions. The spatiotemporal part just means that they tracked where and when events happen, and events are like a catch-all. So an event can be a pass or a shot on net or really any one of these things, though usually it is a pass. The researchers tracked games for 5 countries, the World Cup and European Cup, between 2016 and 2018, and in total they have 3.2 million events made by 4.3 thousand players across 2,000 matches. It's a lot. Each event looks something like this. So this event was a pass, this is when it happened, and we also see where the event started and where the ball ended. The player, though, is just a number. And that's because this number points to another entry in another file, specifically the player's file, where we'll find that 3359 corresponds to Lionel Messi. And we'll also see that Lionel plays the forward position, weighs 72, and is 170 high, and a whole bunch of other stuff. We also see that Lionel's team is the proud nation of 676, which, as you can guess, is a pointer to the team dataset. This is the basic structure of what's called a relational database, data that points to other data. So it's essentially itself like a network. These are super important if you ever want to get into data science or stuff like that. So even if you have zero interest in soccer, I really think this dataset is a good place to get some practice with this kind of data structure. And once you get the hang of it, you can do some really fun stuff. For example, heat maps, like this one for passes. The reason it's so asymmetric is because the positions are all stored so the attack is this way and defense is this way, regardless of which team has the ball. On the defending side, we see the passes tend to happen in the middle as players try to set up for an opening, while on the attacking side, passes happen from the wings because the center is more heavily defended. Close to the net, though, you should probably just take the shot, which is why we also see that the pass density is pretty low here, while the shot density increases. Because we also know who made the pass and what their role is, we can also break down the maps according to the player role. Goalies stay close to their own net, so their pass density is highest back here, whereas forwards are often on the attack, so their passes are on the other side, with midfielders and defenders filling out the rest of the field. And I mean, yeah, they look exactly like you would expect them to, but I don't know, it's just kind of cool seeing the strategy show up in the data, and getting an obvious result is often a good sanity check to make sure that you're not doing anything obviously wrong. I should mention that this is also how I found Alberto Brignoli. I filtered events according to shots, and then filtered further according to successful shots, and then filtered once more according to player role, and found that Alberto Brignoli was the only goalie who had made a successful shot on net. So yeah, you can do some cool stuff with this stuff. That's how you know this part was not scripted. Originally, I had a 5-minute long section on heat maps just because I think they're pretty, but it ended up devolving into me theorizing why you can so clearly see the lines of the soccer field in the heat maps. I still don't really know why, so if you have any kind of ideas and you work with the dataset, I'd love to know. But ultimately, I cut the section because heat maps can't tell us how players interact, which is what we really want. So let's get back to the network. Like I said before, nodes represent players and links represent the number of passes per game. The obvious thing to do would be to look at only passes between team members, and that's what we'll do in a moment, but it's also worth seeing what happens if we consider all passes, which is what this network is. Specifically, it's all passes from the 2018 World Cup, and each player is colored according to the team that they belong to. And while this won't tell us anything about Benevento, I think its shape, owing to the tournament setting, gives us a clear visual for what network analysis is really doing. It's all about structure. For example, the fact that similarly colored nodes tend to bunch up tells us that the vast majority of passes are between players of the same team, which, I mean, you would hope that professional players at the World Cup would at least play better than I do. In terms of the strongest links, those generally belong to the Spanish team. In fact, 7 of the top 10 links in the network belong to the Spanish team, and this trio made up the strongest triangle in the network. Network scientists love looking for strong triangles. Interestingly, the Spanish team didn't do particularly well this year, so it's not enough to have strong links in order to do well. Zooming back out, we'll also see that the tournament creates this very modular structure where the network is primarily broken up into communities of different teams. But suppose that we didn't know which teams were which. In this case, we can run a community detection algorithm, and I'll change the colors now to indicate the communities that it found. And it's not right. But it's not entirely wrong either. The World Cup is organized into 8 groups of 4, so 32 teams in total, where each team in a group plays against each other. That's why we can make out these crosses in the network, and this is what the community detection algorithm is picking out. So even though it's technically wrong, it is reflecting something real about the network, in this case, the tournament structure. Oh, hey, sorry to cut in. One thing I didn't mention is that the community detection algorithms typically have a resolution parameter that roughly sets the size of the communities it finds. What I just showed you was for the default parameter, but if we set it lower, we can find more smaller communities. For example, I've lowered the parameter here until we got 32 communities, and just visually speaking, you can see that it matches the teams quite well. Of course, we can do that here because we know that there are 32 teams, but in general networks, you don't know how many communities there actually are, and how you deal with that kind of stuff really depends on the problem and what pre-existing knowledge you have about the network. For example, if you watch my YouTube subscriber network video over on the main channel, you might remember that we ended up looking at genres of YouTube videos using community detection, but obviously we don't know how many genres there actually are. We just checked to make sure to see that the communities that we found made sense based off of our knowledge of YouTube. Okay, anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Back to the video. So even though it's technically wrong, it is reflecting something real about the network, in this case, the tournament structure. But what I really want to know is this: can we find how well a team did in the World Cup just from the network structure? Well, we can get pretty close pretty easily. For each of the 8 groups, the top 2 teams advance to the next round, and the more games a team plays, the more chances they have to accidentally pass the ball to the wrong team. So what we should really be looking out for are players with lots of links to many different teams other than their own. And luckily there's a word for this: betweenness. It's like this: a node with high betweenness, like this one, is between large clusters of highly connected nodes. Running a betweenness algorithm in Python for the 2018 World Cup network, the players with the top 5 betweennesses are the following, belonging to England, France, Croatia, and Belgium, which were in fact the final 4 teams of the 2018 World Cup and the teams with the highest overall average betweenness. Now, admittedly, I couldn't find a simple method that could determine the actual winner, France, from the network structure alone, but betweenness gets us most of the way there. Again, the better a team did, the more games they play. So if we color each node by the number of games each player played, you can kind of see how betweenness, and more generally the network structure, really is capturing performance of the teams, which I think is super cool. Again, that's kind of essentially what we want to do: find which network features correlate with team performance. That being said, we should be careful not to get our cause and effect mixed up. It's likely not that teams with high betweenness perform well, but rather that in a tournament setting, teams that perform well will have high betweenness. In other words, we can't use what we just did to find which network features predict which teams will do well, which is what I kind of want to do with this. Except here's the thing, this is where the money is. Like, if you can predict which teams will do well, or even at the very least tilt the odds in your favor, then you have a real advantage in certain hobbies. And I'm not really even just talking about soccer here. Like I said at the start, we can take the exact same concept to try to predict which brain scans are indicative of a healthy brain and which ones are not as healthy. That is more or less my job. So again, this is where the money is. Which is to say, this is also where the most development and active research is being done. So rather than try to do something really fancy here that'll be outdated within a month, let's do something simpler that still touches on the fundamentals of what these fancier methods are trying to do. And perhaps one of the most fundamental things that you could do is correlation analysis, which has its problems, and we'll talk about those, but it's always worth using as a first pass. And here's how we're going to do it. Benevento played 38 games. That's 38 individual networks, which we can average into a single team network. Of those 38 games, they won a total of, 6, tied 3, and lost 29, giving them an overall win-loss ratio of 0.197. I know technically for right now we have no context of whether or not that's good, but trust me, it's not great. We can repeat that for all the teams and sort their win-loss ratios in order to get a graph that looks like this. For what we're about to do, the values themselves don't really matter, only the trends do, so I've left them off for my own animation sanity. But in case anyone is wondering, here are the 5 teams with the top win-loss ratios, and here are the teams with the lowest 5. Yeah, that's right. Benevento was tied for the lowest. I'm really sorry any Benevento fans in the audience, which I'm confident there are many of. They just weren't having a good year in this dataset. Our goal now is to see how the win-loss ratio correlates to various properties of the passing networks. Average betweenness, for example, doesn't really seem to have any clear relationship to the win-loss ratio. This again speaks to the fact that what we were seeing before in the World Cup network had more to do with the tournament structure than each individual team. On the other hand, the average number of passes the team makes, which we get just by adding up the links, is pretty strongly correlated with the win-loss ratio. When one is high, the other is high. When one is low, the other is low. Now, I should say, typically when you do correlation analysis, you'd actually do a scatter plot with one variable on the x-axis and the other on the y-axis to get something that looks like this. The reason I'm not doing that here is just because plotting it this way, we can see the actual teams, whereas it'd be much more difficult in a scatter plot. Regardless of how you show it though, the correlation between win-loss ratio and the number of passes is not surprising. After all, the number of passes is going to be heavily related to how much your team possesses the ball, and the more you possess the ball, the better you're likely going to do. So how about something a little bit less obvious? Is it good to have a team that shares the ball equally, or have a single player that's really, really good? In other words, teamwork. One way to do that is network efficiency. If we imagine the links as roads between cities and the strength of the link is the maximum road speed, then the efficiency is a measure of how many options you have to get between cities quickly. So a team that shares a lot might not have any super fast roads, but you'd have way more options across decently fast roads. So maybe less congestion in the analogy. The analogy isn't perfect, but it's not too bad either, and here's the efficiency plotted with the win-loss ratio, which, as you can see, they are fairly correlated. More efficient teams typically perform better, which would suggest that it's more beneficial for the team to work together than to have a single player pulling them. So it's a nice story. Teams with players that contribute equally to passing the ball between themselves many times are also likely to perform well. End of story. Right? Well, you probably know what I'm about to say. Correlation does not mean causation. And, okay, listen, I have a tangent I need to go on. This may be a main channel video one day, so consider this a sneak peek for you true fans. This is the correlation coefficient. It's the most popular way of measuring correlation. 1 means 2 things are perfectly correlated, -1 means perfectly anti-correlated, 0 means not correlated, and we can get anything in between. But just because it measures correlation doesn't make it correlation. Correlation as a word just broadly means 2 things are somehow related, and the correlation coefficient is just one way, arguably the simplest way, of measuring that. Don't get me wrong, it is useful, but it does have its limitations. It's linear, it's a zero lag measure, it's not direct, and it's acausal, or in other words, it can't do causation. But correlation, the concept, does not exclude causation, and misconstruing it with particular measures of correlation is how we get people on the internet repeating correlation doesn't imply causation to the point where it begins to sound like they believe correlation means no causation. A high correlation coefficient is an invitation to investigate causation, not permission to dismiss it outright. So why am I going on about this here? Well, about an hour ago, we concluded that the more equal sharing of the ball is better. And while it would be a nice feel-good takeaway for this video, we have to be careful. For example, it only makes sense to talk about the win-loss ratio as an average across all games. The problem is that across those games, players might change, substitutions, injuries, or even loans, which causes the number of nodes in the network to be different for the different teams. So we might not be making fair comparisons. If we plot the efficiency and the number of players, we see that they're in fact negatively correlated. And what's more, if we control for the number of players, which I've detailed in the description, we actually get that the efficiency is effectively uncorrelated from the win-loss ratio, with a correlation coefficient close to 0. That means that practically all the information about efficiency was actually in the number of players. And I feel like the collective response to that is going to be, well, what was the point to any of this? To which I have a couple of answers. First, have you seen any of my other videos? Second, I really did mainly just want to show off this data set. I think sports stats are a great way of reaching people who might not traditionally like math, so the fact that they release this for free while others will charge you a lot is really awesome. Third, let's actually look at the plot of the win-loss ratio against the number of players. Yeah, that's right. Not only are they highly anti-correlated, but the team with by far the very highest number of players was in fact Benevento, with a total of 41 players. Contrast this to Manchester, the highest performing team, which had 25 players, and the lowest being 22 players for FC Milan, which did respectably well too. The high number of players on Benevento was due to an unusually large number of loans from other teams. During this period, 15 out of the 41 players on Benevento were loans. In fact, Alberto Brignoli, our boy who started off this whole journey, was himself a loan from the team Juventus, and if that name looks familiar, it's because Juventus was the second best performing team in the whole dataset. Benevento had some genuinely good players on it, players from Atalanta, Torino, Fiorentina, highly respectable teams, and Newcastle's there too. But it didn't matter if they had the very best players, they were temporary. Benevento never had the chance to work together as a team, and their performance suffered, and we can see that directly in the networks. So no, correlation analysis as we've done it can't give us causation on its own, but we can use it as a starting point for further investigation. And I should say, I did also do a lot of additional analysis on this. For example, a lot of what we just saw was due to averaging the individual networks into a single team network, which we needed to do to get the win-loss ratio, but we didn't need the win-loss ratio. If instead we only ever looked at networks match by match, then we can make a pile of winning networks and losing networks, which solves the issue of different team sizes. We can then make histograms across various network properties. For example, we still find that the more passes that you make, the better you're likely to do, but there is also a statistically significant preference for winning teams to have higher clustering. That's essentially the number of triangles in the network. I told you network scientists really like triangles. And while not technically a network feature, I did also really like this plot. It's the joint probability of winning and losing scores. Essentially, it tells us the relationship between winning scores and losing scores in a match. That would help you answer, for example, if a team got a score of 4, what's the probability that they won? This method is like a complementary analysis and one that leads more towards regression or classification analysis. Which is my final point with this. Correlation analysis, just like any other mathematical tool, has its strengths and weaknesses. We could have done something way more sophisticated, like temporal graph analysis, which is also gaining ground in neuroscience and fraud detection in finance, or machine learning models for classification and regression analysis. Or GNNs, graph neural networks, which may be able to identify certain patterns in the network associated with winning teams. All of these methods solve some issues of correlation analysis while introducing their own mathematically complicated and, in my opinion, easier to fall into traps. And here it's fine, whatever, we're just having some fun, who really cares? But it's very different when you're working with real-world data like in finance or with the brain. The worst case scenario isn't that you'll get garbage, but rather that you'll get something that looks like it could be right. I think right now doing analysis like this is easier than it's ever been before. Like, here's the code to do literally all the correlation analysis I did in the video. It's like 6 lines of code and is probably twice as long as a competent coder would need. So we're living in a time when the math has become increasingly easier to perform, but simultaneously harder to understand on a fundamental level. And I think that's where today's sponsor Brilliant comes into play. Brilliant is the online learning platform with thousands of lessons on topics in mathematics, science, programming, data science, and more. Their approach is to help you build critical thinking skills rather than memorizing by breaking these topics into structured and coherent lessons that build on each other, but always paced in such a way so as to not be overwhelming. That way you can develop a daily learning habit to help you get a little smarter every day rather than crashing and burning all at once. I went through their data science courses, and even though I had personally already seen a lot of the material before, I still found myself thinking, oh wow, that really made it click. Like, I don't know, something about their visualization and pacing really made R² finally clear to me in a way that it hadn't been before. And I was genuinely impressed by how in-depth the later lessons go. There's super popular stuff like classification and clustering, but there's also modules on how to assess how good a statistical model is and what is overfitting. In my opinion, arguably some of the most important aspects of proper data analysis. So yeah, if that sounds up your alley, visit the link in the description, brilliant.org/actuallynotdavid, or scan the QR code for you TV watchers to check out what Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. And if you're really impressed, there's also a 20% discount for an annual subscription. So yeah, a big thanks to Brilliant and a big thanks to all of you for watching. I'm really sorry, Benevento fans.